So our next
Thank you.
presenter is Karin Frey, Research Associate Professor of Educational Psychology at the University of Washington. Karin did some really very important work on observations of bullying experiences on the playground and has great ways to measure that. It's a hard thing to do, and was also involved in a school-wide intervention, Steps to Respect, but she didn't want to talk about that today. And I think this idea of culture, when we think about bullying as a group phenomenon, thinking about the role of culture, cultural norms for retaliation and reciprocity, I think that you're going to be talking about that today a little bit, right?
A little bit, yeah.
Okay.
I've got a lot to talk about, so
All
I'm
right.
going to go pretty
Okay.
fast. I do have slides if you want to ask questions about intervention later on. We are definitely indebted to Christina. Her theoretical and empirical work has helped provide much of the framework for how we think about group processes and bullying. Along with my colleagues and I, we've used a slightly different toolbox. And as a result of our methods, which include, as Sandra mentioned, second-by-second observations on the school ground and also in-depth interviews, we've tended to focus more on the participant role fluidity, the movement between the roles of bully, victim, bystander, even as we see consistent patterns within that. This movement helps explain why retaliation and reciprocity plays an important role in the bullying process. So some of this is going to deal with students in grades 3 and 6 whom we observed, and we identified sharp differences in aggressive patterns that are related to the function and form of aggression. Function is either defensive or reactive, or it is reward-seeking and dominance-seeking. The former is typical of victims who are defending themselves, and the latter is typical of bullies. We can also talk about the former method of aggression, either direct, face-to-face, verbal and physical aggression, or indirect, rumors, slanders, organized exclusion. So out of 600 students in this study, we found that 68% displayed aggression at least once during the 50-minute total observation period. And we found 3 types of aggressors. The largest group, 43%, consisted of aggressive victims. These kids were not using bullying very much. They rarely engaged in bullying, but they reacted aggressively and directly to bullying, frustrations, other provocations. If we look here, the solid rust and the solid dark blue, which looks black, is bullying, where you have the typical difference in power. The dotted green refers to reactive aggression, which lacks that power differential. Our aggressive victims, you can see they weren't bullying, but they did lack self-regulation. They're frequently argumentative, it's often devolved into aggression, and they were usually impulsive, disorganized, and somewhat ineffective in their aggression. In contrast, 18% of our group were quite socially skilled bullies. The middle group had the highest level of agreeable behavior, even more agreeable than the non-aggressive kids. And they do a lot of indirect bullying, rumors, exclusion, and so forth. They rarely bullied in face-to-face encounters. On the right, the bully victims represented only 7% of our sample. They displayed very high levels of direct bullying and very high levels of reactive aggression. They were the most argumentative of our groups. This was the only group that also showed a developmental change. They engaged in very little indirect bullying as third and fourth graders, but a lot in grades 5 and 6. Given these profiles, it's not surprising that most teachers do not readily identify indirect bullies as aggressors. They may be cruel on the playground, but they're very agreeable. They don't make trouble in class. Wendy and Deb Pepler also saw that in some of their early work. So they don't stand out the way the bully victims do. And the aggressive victims are often misidentified as bullies, even though that's not their typical pattern. Here you see the victimization experiences among the three aggressive groups on the left-hand side. Again, solid rust and blue represent victimization in which there is a power differential. The dotted greens represents times when these individuals were targeted for retaliatory aggression. So you can see when we're looking at the left three columns that the type of victimization and targeting experience grossly mimics the pattern, the profile of aggression within those three groups. Our indirect bullies were mostly targeted for indirect bullying themselves. Now, there are also high levels of victimization in the two non-aggressive victim groups, but quite distinct profiles here. Non-victims, that was 25% of our populations. So these two non-aggressive victim groups are pretty small. If we look at our bystander behavior, we see that the indirect victims, they were bystanders. They reinforced bullying at very high rates. So these youngsters were in proximity to indirect bullies. They were listening, they were reinforcing, and they got bullied a lot. If we look at our direct victims, we see that they are bystanders to direct bullying at high rates, just like our aggressive victims and our bully victims. Now, it's possible that censoring of the data, we didn't watch them long enough to see aggression on their part, but still we have very high levels of reinforcement here. So I think it's safe to say that at least among these victim groups, that there is perhaps some kind of attraction to high arousal situations that include bullying. We attend very closely to reactive aggression because it's closely tied to bullying. So for example, on the left, you can see that children with high hourly rates of reactive aggression in the fall experience increases in spring victimization. The magnitude is fairly large. Direct victimization increases by more than 0.8 events per hour, and indirect victimization by 0.4 events per hour. Just as disturbing, if we look on the right-hand column, we see that those who display high rates of direct bullying in the fall experience reductions in spring victimization. A drop in direct victimization of 1 event per hour and in indirect victimization of 0.4 events per hour. This suggests that for some kids, bullying may offer a somewhat high-risk route out of victimization, which poses certainly a challenge for intervention. We're also interested in classroom influences, behavior, and attitudes endorsing retaliation. Among individual students, we find that reactive aggression is higher in the spring when their classmates shared the belief that retaliating is the right thing to do. So if we look third row from the bottom at class beliefs, we find that if classmates believe that retaliation is the right thing to do in the fall, in the spring, then we see increases in reactive aggression. Teens report that when kids encourage them to retaliate, they often feel flooded by a confusing and disorganizing massive emotions. So it's not surprising that a classmate endorsement of retaliation would be associated with reactive aggression. However, that's not what we find among bullying. If we look on the right-hand column, we see no relationship to classmate beliefs. Remember, skilled bullies tend to be more self-controlled than we see in reactive aggressors. Retaliation is not always impulsive and hot-headed. And both theory and empirical evidence indicate that retaliation can be strategic and it can help maintain power and dominance. If you're a savvy bully, you may very carefully choose a venue for retaliation so that you have a large sample and you're sure of being able to humiliate your victim and plenty of bystanders to watch it. So here we see that personal beliefs are in the fall are associated with increases in spring bullying. So kids that believe it's correct to retaliate in the fall will show higher levels of bullying in the springtime. Classroom rates of bullying and reactive aggression are associated with different trends over the school year. If the classroom starts off with a lot of reactive aggression, then they tend to see increases in both reactive aggression and bullying over the school year. On the other hand, if the class starts off with high levels of bullying in the fall, then we see decreases in both reactive aggression and bullying in the springtime. This may indicate classrooms in which dominant aggressors have bullied their classmates into submission, and then they can maintain their position of dominance with less coercive means. This raises a practical question: what happens in those classrooms when a program comes in and upsets the status quo? Is there at least a temporary increase in bullying, perhaps similar to what we see in extinction curves, where a negative behavior increases after the reinforcement is removed before it eventually decreases? This is something that we need to know. We have a very strong need for additional work on the change process. We know from our studies on intervention that not all classrooms show a decrease in the first year. It takes 2 years to see a general increase. Again, these are expensive studies, but are really needed. Before I stop today, I want to point out another big need for information about cultural differences in response to threat. Every culture has strategies and rituals that help contain conflict and violence within that culture. Right now, we're interviewing middle school and high school students to learn how culture and friends influence responses to threats, including bullying and ethnic discrimination. We know that friends will encourage revenge, discourage revenge, and even mediate. They even take revenge on behalf of their friends, whether the friend is a victim of bullying or whether their friend is an initiator of bullying. So defense goes 2 ways. Our early work indicates that these different actions appear to have powerful and quite different effects on the self-identity of our individuals and on the I'm sorry. I should have made sure that this was actually going ahead with me. Shoot. Okay. Because of fluidity in roles, students have many opportunities to reciprocate a friend's action, and they usually feel highly obligated to do so. Obligation is especially strong for young people from face and dignity cultures. For that reason, they may be more susceptible to peer influence, both positive and negative, than young people from dignity cultures. We also find that bystanders are the easiest to change. Both young people and our educators need information about the conflict containment strategies that are used by individuals from different cultures. Many of those strategies are so culturally specific that they're useless when used with people from other cultures. It's also important to understand that culturally specific strategies do not map neatly onto visible ethnic characteristics. For example, if we look within continents, like pre-colonial North America, Africa, we find ecological niches that lend themselves to honor, face, and dignity cultures, and we find descriptions of groups living in those areas that are consistent with those cultural types. The most well-researched cultural divide is between European American dignity cultures in the north and European American honor cultures in the south. We lack information about other cultural groups. This is important because when someone violates our implicit norms, we react as though the person has a deficit. We see this in school all the time. Peers act as though someone is weird, and teachers act as though they have a deficit that may or may not actually exist. We need to know a lot more about this. Sorry.